53 shootings in a single weekend. 74 children nearly deported before a federal judge stopped the planes. 10,000 protesters flooding Chicago's streets, chanting "We will not kneel." And inside Congress, Jasmine Crockett forced Donald Trump into 47 seconds of humiliating silence broadcast live to 330 million Americans. This is not just about immigration, it's about power, fear, and the fight for America's soul. When the truth freezes a president, what will your votes fight for today? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under a brooding September sky, Chicago trembled with the sound of footsteps and fury. Tens of thousands poured into the streets, fists raised, placards flashing under the glare of cameras. "Chicago will not kneel." The chants rolled like thunder between glass towers, echoing across the river, shaking the very ground beneath. Helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights carving restless beams into the smoke of flare guns and banners. On every news channel, the chyron blared in red. Trump vows 30-day crackdown. ICE surge imminent. This was no ordinary Labor Day. This was a city on the edge of confrontation with the most powerful man in the nation. Inside the Capitol, in a chamber already buzzing with tension, the camera cut sharply to Jasmine Crockett. She strode through the double doors with the defiance of someone who knew history was watching, her heels striking marble like war drums. In one hand, a thick folder of evidence; in the other, the steady pose of a woman who had turned every insult into armor. Commentators whispered her name as if invoking a storm. "Crockett's coming." The chamber fell into an uneasy hush as Trump himself leaned back in his chair, lips curling into that familiar smirk, his eyes scanning the room as though daring anyone to challenge him. But Jasmine did not look away. She locked onto him like a predator finding its mark. The television audience, tens of millions across the country, watched as the scene split-screened. The chaos of Chicago outside, with 10,000 protesters swelling like a tidal wave, and the solemn, suffocating silence of Congress inside. Every chant outside made its way in faintly through microphones. "Stand up, Chicago, no fear." The crowd seemed to bleed into the chamber, their voices layering over the polished words of politicians. This was no longer politics, it was theater of survival. And standing at the center of it was Jasmine Crockett, a woman who had chosen this exact battlefield to make her stand. Reporters scribbled furiously, anchors murmured into hot mix. Will she call him out? Will she break the script? One producer whispered in a control room, already. Hashtags were trending. Hashtag Chicago under siege. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Somewhere, a pundit muttered, this could be her moment or her downfall. The suspense was electric, like a string pulled taut, ready to snap. Jasmine took her seat, placed the folder before her, and leaned slightly into the microphone. The camera zoomed in on her face, jaw set, eyes glinting with a cold fire. Then came the line that sliced through the air and landed across living rooms in America like a blade. When fear becomes policy, who will stand for justice? The room did not breathe. The streets outside roared louder. Trump smirked again, but this time his eyes flickered. And millions watching leaned forward, sensing the collision that was about to redefine the word showdown. The chamber doors creaked open again, and the air itself seemed to tighten as Donald Trump strode in, surrounded by aides who moved like shadows. The smirk was already fixed on his face, that same expression he had worn on countless rallies, a mask of arrogance sharpened into weaponry. Cameras zoomed as he took his seat, leaned into the microphone, and without hesitation, delivered the line designed to dominate every headline. Chicago is a killing field. His voice cut through the room like a blade, heavy with certainty, crafted to ignite fear. The chamber erupted in whispers, some lawmakers nodding, others grimacing, while millions at home held their breath. But almost instantly, the screens flanking the hearing room flickered to life. Instead of fear-driven rhetoric, data exploded across the monitor's charts, FBI statistics, a cold, undeniable truth. Homicide rates weren't rising, they were falling. The red line that Trump had painted in speeches was shrinking in reality. A hush fell as journalists scrambled to capture the contradiction, their pens scratching like gunfire. Tension gripped the room. Was the president's narrative collapsing under the weight of his own numbers? Then came the voice of Chicago's Mayor Brandon Johnson, projected into the chamber through a pre-recorded statement that jolted the audience. His words were firm, unflinching. No Chicago police officer will serve as ICE's hand. The declaration ricocheted like a shot fired inside the chamber, a direct refusal to bend, a mayor standing between his city and the federal storm. Gasps scattered through the rows of lawmakers, while outside, protesters roared louder, as if Johnson's words had reached their ears instantly. Signs waved higher, chants thundered stronger. "Chicago will not kneel," became a war cry, echoing against marble walls and steel barricades. For a fleeting moment, hope surged in the crowd, a current of defiance coursing through the people watching on screens across America. But inside the chamber, the anxiety deepened, pressing down like a storm cloud ready to burst. Trump's fingers tightened on the table, his jaw clenched, and his smirk faltered for the briefest second. Jasmine Crockett leaned forward ever so slightly, her eyes locked on him, every inch of her posture daring him to challenge the facts laid bare before the nation. She was not just listening, she was preparing to strike, to turn his own narrative into a weapon against him. The split-screen broadcast captured it all. On one side, a president branding a city as broken. On the other, a city's leaders and citizens rejecting his frame, fighting to reclaim their dignity. Millions of viewers leaned closer to their televisions, caught in the friction of two Americas colliding: fear versus truth, domination versus resistance. The tension was unbearable, the stage perfectly set for a confrontation that promised to be nothing short of historic. And as the camera panned back to Jasmine, her eyes glinting with an unspoken challenge, the question seared through every mind watching. When a president builds his power on fear, who will have the courage to tear it down in front of the world? Governor J.B. Pritzker's voice thundered through the chamber's speakers, transmitted live from Illinois, and it landed like a grenade. "If they send the National Guard into Chicago without our consent, that is not enforcement, that is an invasion." The word invasion crackled in the air, raw, inflammatory, impossible to ignore. Some lawmakers shifted in their seats, others glanced nervously at Trump, who now sat still, lips pressed tightly together. The statement was more than defiance, it was an accusation of tyranny. Outside, the crowd picked it up like wildfire, chanting, "No invasion, no invasion," until the Capitol itself seemed to vibrate with the rhythm of their rage. Journalists huddled together, whispering into handheld recorders, their words caught by hot mix-feeding networks across America. "This isn't just about law anymore," one muttered. "It's about 2026 politics. It's about power," another scribbled on his notepad. "Chicago equals battleground. Crockett versus Trump equals headline." The commentary spread like an infection, every whisper growing louder in the public imagination, every analysis framing this not as a policy debate, but as a duel that could shape the next election. The stakes were no longer hidden. They were laid bare for the nation to see. Jasmine Crockett sat still, almost unnervingly calm, her hands folded on the folder before her. Then, slowly, she raised her head and fixed her gaze on Trump. No words passed between them, but the silence was louder than any insult. Trump leaned back, the smirk returning, though thinner now, less certain, as if he knew the cameras were recording the weight of that stare. Millions at home felt the electricity of the moment, the stillness that precedes a storm, the raw inevitability of collision. Jasmine's eyes did not waver. She was already stripping away the armor of bravado he carried into every room. The chamber became a theater of anticipation. Protesters' roar seeped through the walls, journalists leaned closer to their microphones, and America sat on the edge of its seat, bracing for the explosion no one could stop. Everything was converging: the mayor's defiance, the governor's accusation, the president's looming threats, and Jasmine's unwavering presence. Each thread tightened into a single knot, waiting for the blade that would cut it open before the nation's eyes. And then, silence, a silence so sharp it seemed to slice through the marble columns and hang heavy over the entire country. Every camera zoomed tighter, every heartbeat quicker, as two figures, Crockett and Trump, locked in a stare that told the story better than any speech. It was a silence thick with questions, trembling with the promise of revelation. And across America, from living rooms to protest lines, the question began to echo, relentless and unshakable. When that silence finally breaks, whose voice will define the truth? Trump leaned forward, his hands gripping the table as if to anchor himself, and with a booming voice that ricocheted off the marble walls, he delivered his opening strike. 53 shootings last weekend. 53. That proves my point. Chicago is out of control, a killing field that only federal power can fix. The words hung heavy in the chamber, A brutal statistic transformed into a weapon. Gasps rippled through the audience, reporters scribbling furiously. Cameras zooming in on his face, he leaned back with a smug satisfaction, certain he had just seized the narrative. The silence that followed wasn't relief, it was suffocation. Lawmakers exchanged nervous glances, some nodding, others looking away in discomfort, while millions of viewers at home felt the weight of the number like a hammer striking the table. The protesters outside, already seething, roared louder as if to answer him, chants colliding with the televised words, "Chicago will not kneel." The contrast was dizzying. On one side, a president declaring a city broken; on the other, a city screaming back that it was alive. And then Jasmine Crockett's voice cut through the noise like glass shattering. She didn't wait her turn, didn't let the smugness settle. She slammed her hand on the folder in front of her, eyes burning into Trump, and said with razor-edged clarity, "Stop weaponizing tragedy to mask your agenda." The chamber froze. Even the protesters outside seemed to hush for a moment, as though the force of her words reached them through stone and steel. Her tone wasn't pleading, it wasn't debating, it was an indictment, delivered with the certainty of a verdict. Trump blinked, momentarily caught off guard, his smirk faltering as the cameras captured every flicker of discomfort. He tried to recover, leaning toward the mic, but Jasmine wasn't finished. She pressed on, her voice low but fierce. "Those 53 lives deserve justice, not exploitation. You invoked their blood to sell fear, not to save lives." The chamber erupted not with applause, but with a sharp intake of collective breath, a sound of shock and disbelief that reverberated into the microphones and out across America. Emotion surged like a tide, anger from Trump's allies, disbelief from the undecided, and a swelling current of hope from those who saw Jasmine standing unflinching against the storm. The air quivered with the possibility of collapse, of something breaking loose. For a split second, it seemed as if Trump might shout her down, that his temper would ignite, but instead he leaned back again, jaw clenched, eyes narrowing into slits. The cameras lingered on his silence, the way it betrayed him more than words ever could. And as the screen split once more outside, 10,000 voices thundering against fear. Inside, to figures locked in open combat, millions of viewers leaned forward, caught in the tension of the moment. They weren't just watching a hearing anymore. They were watching a reckoning. Live, unedited, irreversible. And as Jasmine held her stare, unshaken, the question that pulsed across every screen was no longer about crime or numbers, it was something far more primal, far more dangerous. When a president turns bodies into talking points, who will stop him before the next name becomes another statistic? Jasmine didn't flinch under the weight of Trump's accusation. She rose from her seat with a controlled fury, pulling a single sheet of paper from her folder and sliding it across the desk as though it were a blade. 53 shootings, she repeated, her voice steady, almost chilling. But here's what you didn't tell America. With a sharp motion of her hand, she signaled the technician. The screens lining the chamber burst to life, bathing the room in a cold blue glow. Bar charts and hard numbers filled the space, each one a dagger aimed at Trump's narrative. The headline across the top screamed louder than any chant: FBI. Homicide in Chicago down 17%. The silence that followed was not the silence of respect, it was the silence of disbelief. Gasps rippled through the chamber as lawmakers craned their necks to see, their eyes widening at the irrefutable truth. On the split screen, Trump's words were played with closed captions, a killing field, while the chart beside them painted a very different reality. The contrast was damning. Every percentage drop glared like a spotlight, exposing the gap between fear-mongering and fact. Jasmine didn't stop there. "Chicago isn't dying," she declared, voice rising with each syllable. "It's healing. And you, Mr. President, are trying to bury that progress beneath a coffin of lies." The microphones picked up the muffled roar outside, the chants from thousands of protesters filtering into the chamber like thunder through cracked stone. Chicago will not kneel. It was faint but unmistakable, their rhythm syncing with Jasmine's words, as if the city itself had become her choir. The audience inside shifted, some leaning forward in awe, others shrinking back in fear of what would come next. Reporters, pens scratched furiously, analysts whispered into live cameras, and across the country, viewers watched a man who thrived on chaos being cornered by raw evidence. Trump shifted in his chair, tugging at his collar, his smirk cracking under the weight of silence. He opened his mouth, but no words came, his voice, always booming, faltered against the cold indifference of numbers. Jasmine pressed the moment harder, her tone slicing through the static. Do not twist tragedy into your campaign slogan. Do not spit on the lives of Chicagoans to build your empire of fear. Facts matter, lives matter, and today, the truth stands taller than your rhetoric. The chamber vibrated with tension, the kind that precedes either explosion or collapse. Viewers at home felt the pulse in their own chests, the undeniable sense that something historic was unfolding before their eyes. And as Jasmine's words echoed, the bar charts glowed like proof carved in stone, the chants outside swelled louder, and the split screen tightened once again on Trump's face. America leaned closer, breathless, because the question had shifted. No longer was it whether Jasmine could withstand Trump, it was whether Trump could withstand the truth. And in that electric moment, the unspoken challenge hung over the nation like a storm cloud ready to burst. When fear collides with facts under the glare of history, which one will survive the night? Trump's knuckles drummed impatiently on the polished desk before he lunged for the microphone, his voice rising above the rustle of papers and the crackle of live feeds. You're just a puppet lawyer for chaos, he spat, his words dripping with contempt, his gaze locked on Jasmine like a predator daring its prey to flinch. The insult landed heavy in the chamber, a deliberate attempt to cut her down not with argument, but with venom. Gasps erupted from the audience, some covering their mouths, others leaning forward with morbid fascination, sensing that civility had just been ripped from the stage. Jasmine didn't blink. She rose slightly from her chair, not enough to stand but enough to tower over the insult hurled in her direction. The camera zoomed in on her face, calm yet blazing, a storm contained in flesh and bone. She leaned forward, her voice sharp and unyielding, every syllable forged like iron. Better a lawyer for the people than a salesman of lies. The words detonated in the chamber like a blast, slamming against marble walls and ricocheting through microphones into millions of living rooms. The crowd outside, though unaware of the exact exchange, seemed to sense it instantly, their chants swelling, fists pumping as if echoing her defiance. Trump's jaw tightened, his face glistening under the relentless lights, beads of sweat betraying the fury he tried to mask with a smirk. He leaned back, then forward again, caught between arrogance and anger, his fingers gripping the microphone so hard the metal bent. Cameras capture every twitch, every flicker of rage across his face, broadcasting vulnerability where there had once been dominance. Jasmine, meanwhile, stood unshaken, her eyes locked on him with the steadiness of someone who had endured every insult before and turned each one into fuel. The atmosphere spiraled into open hostility. Lawmakers shifted in their seats, some whispering for order, others frozen, unwilling to interrupt what was becoming less a hearing and more a battlefield. Journalists scribbled furiously, some mouthing the quotes into live feeds, their eyes darting between Trump's unraveling composure and Jasmine's rising authority. The tension was unbearable, like watching two tectonic plates grinding against each other, the inevitable quake waiting to shatter the ground beneath. Viewers across America were transfixed, their screens filled with split images, Trump's reddening face, Jasmine's unbreakable stare, the roaring protesters outside pounding at the gates of power. It was no longer a debate over crime statistics or immigration enforcement. It was a raw collision of truth and deceit, courage and intimidation, justice and manipulation. The insult had opened the floodgates, and now the question wasn't whether the chamber could contain the fire, but whether the nation itself could. And as the noise swelled, as the fury mounted, and as the world leaned closer to witness every second of this showdown, the final question carved itself into the silence between their words, demanding an answer not just from them, but from every soul watching. When insult replaces policy and venom drowns out reason, can truth survive the noise or will it be buried beneath the roar? The gavel struck once, but the room never settled. The chairman turned toward the witness table where DHS Secretary Kristi Noem sat, posture stiff, hands folded too tightly, the faint tremor of her fingers betraying the calm mask on her face. Jasmine's eyes narrowed, sensing the hesitation before the words even came. "Madam Secretary." Jasmine began, her tone deliberate, slicing through the air. "Can you confirm whether the administration is preparing to deploy ICE, Border Patrol, or even the National Guard into Chicago under the so-called 30-day crackdown?" The pause stretched long enough to rattle the cameras. Noem finally exhaled, her voice clipped and careful, but laced with unease. "We do not exclude any option." The chamber erupted in murmurs, some audible enough for microphones to pick up. "Any option." The words landed like an earthquake, shaking the floor of credibility beneath her. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her hand moved swiftly to the thick folder before her, and with the precision of a blade being unsheathed, she withdrew a single document. She raised it high enough for cameras to catch, then laid it flat on the desk. "Then perhaps, Madam Secretary, you'd care to explain this." A murmur turned into a rumble as screens flickered. The leaked memo projected in bold letters for every eye in the chamber and every living room across America. "Use Chicago to showcase strength before elections," gasps tore through the room. Journalists nearly fell over themselves as pens scratched furiously, some shouting for their producers, others whispering into live microphones with the urgency of breaking news. Trump shifted violently in his chair, his smirk evaporating into something harder, darker. He gripped the armrest, but Jasmine wasn't looking at him. She was staring down Noam, who now looked corner under the blinding spotlight of truth. "Showcase strength," Jasmine repeated slowly, her voice deliberate, venomous. "This isn't about law. It isn't about safety. This is about using Chicago, its people, its pain as your political stage." The chamber roared, not with applause, but with the fever of disbelief, the realization that the facade was cracking in real time. Outside, the protesters' chants intensified, almost as if they had heard the words themselves. "No invasion. Chicago will not kneel." The sound bled through the stone walls, turning the chamber into an echo chamber of rebellion. Reporters on the steps of the Capitol began shouting into live cameras, the headlines already forming. "Chicago plan leak politics over people." Jasmine leaned closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a near whisper that forced the room to lean in. "Tell us, Madam Secretary, how many families will be torn apart? How many children shoved onto planes? How many neighborhoods militarized, just so the president can show strength on television?" The question hit harder than any scream. The chamber froze, journalists scribbled with shaking hands, and every viewer at home knew the moment had shifted from politics to revelation. And as Trump's face hardened, as Noam's composure crumbled, and as Jasmine's words cut into the marrow of the moment, the question seared into every screen, pulsing with unbearable weight. If democracy itself is reduced to a stage for power, who will be left to speak for the people once the curtain falls? Trump could not contain himself. His chair screeched against the floor as he leaned forward, slamming both palms onto the desk with a crack that made the microphones jump. His voice thundered through the chamber, raw and venomous, shattering the fragile order. "Fake news, witch hunt, nothing but lies cooked up by my enemies to smear me." His face flushed crimson, sweat gleaming under the relentless lights, eyes darting toward the cameras as though trying to burn a hole through the lens. The chamber erupted, lawmakers shouting over one another, reporters scrambling to capture every word, the air itself charged with chaos. But amid the storm, Jasmine Crockett sat unmoving. Her stillness was almost unbearable, like a statue carved from steel. She let his fury crash against her silence, the contrast itself a weapon. Then, when the nose reached its crescendo, she leaned in slowly, her eyes never leaving his, and spoke with a cold precision that sliced deeper than any shout. "Then swear under oath it doesn't exist." The words dropped like lead, so heavy they seemed to pull the chamber into silence. The roar outside softened, the shouts within dimmed, and for a fleeting second, time itself stalled. Trump recoiled slightly, the demand hanging in the air like a guillotine blade suspended by a thread. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. His jaw clenched, his teeth grinding audibly against the microphone. The camera zoomed tighter, capturing every twitch of his face, the widening of his eyes, the pulse in his temple. Millions watching from home leaned closer, sensing the shift, the master of volume cornered by the simplicity of a question. Jasmine did not relent. "One line, one oath, that's all it takes. Will you tell the American people under penalty of perjury that this memo, these words, this plan, does not exist?" Her tone was quiet, deliberate, dangerous. The chamber buzzed with electricity, the tension coiling tighter with every second of his silence. Even Noam, seated a few feet away, looked down at her nose, unwilling to meet Jasmine's gaze. Trump slammed his hand against the table again, repeating fake. Fake, but the desperation in his voice betrayed him. It was no longer dominance, it was panic disguised as rage. The journalists smelled it, scribbling frantically, whispering into cameras, "He won't swear. He won't deny." The contrast was unbearable. Trump's unhinged outburst colliding against Jasmine's icy control. One man unraveling, one woman unbreakable. The audience, both in the chamber and across the nation, could feel the seesaw tilting, the spectacle morphing into revelation. This was no longer just a hearing, it was a trial in the court of public opinion, and the verdict was being written in real time. Jasmine's voice cut through once more, her words deliberate, each syllable a hammer driving the point deeper. If the truth is fake, why are you so afraid to swear it? And as Trump's silence thickened, as fury masked fear and the cameras captured his hesitation for history, the question surged through every living room, every protest line, every newsroom in America. When power is cornered by truth, will it fight with honor or collapse under its own nose? The moment Trump faltered, the screens in newsrooms across the nation lit up in unison. CNN, MSNBC, Fox, local affiliates from coast to coast. The breaking banner bled across every chyron in bold red letters, "Secret Chicago Plan." The caption pulsed on millions of televisions, a question that read more like a verdict. In living rooms and airports, in diners and bars, people froze mid-step, mid-bite, mid-conversation, all pulled into the vortex of the spectacle. The headline wasn't just reporting, it was detonating. Inside the chamber, the buzz turned feverish. Lawmakers leaned into one another, their whispers frantic, their faces pale under the harsh lights. Some scribbled notes, others stared at Trump, watching his jaw grind and his knuckles whiten against the table. The press corps looked like a pack of wolves unleashed, reporters lunging toward microphones, shouting to their editors in half-sentences, leaked memo. Elections, political weapon, unprecedented. The hum of panic mingled with the chant of protesters outside, now louder, sharper, angrier, as though the crowd had somehow read the memo themselves. Chicago will not kneel, no invasion. The sound rattled the glass panes of the chamber windows, a heartbeat sensing perfectly with the tremor of the nation. Jasmine remained motionless, her silence as deliberate as her words had been. She let the chaos expand around her, let the headlines spiral, let the chants invade the room. She didn't need to speak, the evidence was already screaming louder than she ever could. Her eyes never left Trump, drilling into him like a spotlight, exposing every crack in his armor. Trump shifted again, tugging at his tie, his smirk gone, replaced by the stiff mask of a man who had lost control of the script. He barked something about total hoax, but his voice was drowned out, swallowed whole by the chant outside and the captions inside. Every camera zoomed in closer, the sweat pooling on his brow. The nervous tap of his index finger, the quick glance toward his lawyers, who refused to meet his eyes. These were not the images of a man in command. They were the fragments of power splintering in real time, and Jasmine knew it. Her hand hovered over the microphone, not rushing, not pressing, just waiting, letting the suspense grow unbearable. The entire room leaned forward as if gravity itself pulled them closer, every second of silence more deafening than the last. This was no longer a hearing, it was a national reckoning. Live, raw, uncontainable. The leaked memo had escaped the folder, escaped the chamber, escaped even Washington. It belonged to the public now, and it was rewriting the narrative at the speed of light. In Chicago, protesters waved their phones in the air, screens glowing with the headline "Secret Chicago Plan." As if they were torches of defiance, across America, hashtags trended, tweets fired like bullets, talk shows broke format to cut live. And in that moment, with the nation roaring outside, and the evidence hanging above him like a noose, Trump sat cornered, trapped in a silence more powerful than his fury. Jasmine finally leaned into her mic, her voice steady, almost calm, but sharp enough to cut through the chaos. What happens, Mr. President, when the plan you deny is the very one already in motion? The chamber went still, the chant outside surged louder. And America, holding its breath, understood they were no longer watching politics, they were watching history fracture in real time. The chamber was still vibrating from the revelation of the leaked memo when Jasmine raised her hand for silence. Without a word, she nodded to the technician. The screens flickered again, but this time no charts or documents appeared. Instead, the image of a little girl filled the walls of Congress, her face pale under fluorescent light, her eyes swollen from nights of fear. In her arms, a worn brown teddy bear, missing one button eye, clutched like it was the last anchor keeping her afloat. Her voice trembled, broken but piercing through every microphone in the room. My mom is dead. Please. Don't send me back. The words were daggers. The lawmakers who moments earlier argued over statistics now sat paralyzed, their mouths half open, pens frozen mid-note. Gasps rippled across the chamber, but no one dared to speak. Even the protesters outside, caught on live microphones, seemed to hush for a moment as if the city itself bowed to the gravity of the plea. Maria's eyes darted nervously off camera, and her small hands tightened around the bear as though she expected it to be ripped away. The silence that followed was heavier than any shout. Jasmine's voice broke through, steady, deliberate, refusing to let the moment dissipate. This child is not a number. She is not a pawn in your politics. She is 10 years old, alone, and already carrying more grief than any of us here will ever know. The camera cut to Trump, his face stiffening, jaw clenched, fingers drumming on the desk, but even his usual arsenal of interruption seemed frozen in his throat. His eyes flicked toward the screen, then away again, as though even he could not bear the direct gaze of innocence. One senator reached for a tissue, another pressed a hand to his forehead, while reporters scribbled frantically, knowing they were witnessing the moment that could define the hearing. Maria's voice repeated, on loop, played back by news outlets across the globe. Please don't send me back. Each replay cut deeper into the nation's conscience, each syllable louder than any rally cry. The chamber had become a courtroom of humanity, and the jury was the American people. Jasmine turned, her eyes sweeping the room, her tone rising like a hammer striking steel. What kind of country listens to a child beg for her life and calls it border security? What kind of leader hears his plea and sees only an opportunity for applause? Her words cracked through the silence, turning guilt into fury, despair into indignation. The protesters outside erupted once more, their chants now fused with Maria's plea, a chorus of defiance that shook the Capitol's foundations. And as the camera zoomed in on Trump's face, sweat beading, jaw locked, silence betraying him, the nation realized the clash had entered a new battlefield. This was no longer about numbers, memos, or political theater. It was about a child holding a teddy bear, begging not to be sent back to the place where nightmares waited. And the question seared itself into the conscience of every viewer, a demand that could not be ignored. When even a child's cry cannot pierce the armor of power, what does it take to break the silence of a nation? The echo of Maria's trembling plea still clung to the chamber walls, and every phone in the press gallery buzzed at once. Screens lit up, producers shouted, and suddenly every news chyron across America turned blood red. Federal judge halts deportation of 70 for Guatemalan children, some already boarded planes. The word scrolled like a siren, cutting across networks in real time. Gasps tore through the hearing room, the kind that ripple and history shifts in a heartbeat. Journalists sprang to their feet, cameras zoomed tighter, and outside, the chants swelled as protesters learned the news within seconds, their voices rising into a tidal wave that shook the marble columns. Jasmine seized the silence, her hand resting on Maria's image still glowing across the screen. Her voice carried with the weight of the revelation, firm, unrelenting, each word echoing like a verdict. These aren't statistics, these are lads. The chamber quivered under the force of her tone. She gestured toward the chyron, her words cutting like glass. 70 for children. Children were already strapped into their seats on planes, engines warming, before a judge had to step in at the last possible second to stop this government from sending them back to danger. Her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with rage sharpened into steel. In the public gallery, a woman covered her face with trembling hands, shoulders heaving. A young man wiped tears with the back of his sleeve. Even seasoned lawmakers, hardened by decades of political battle, shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting to the floor, unable to withstand the raw humanity flooding the room. Reporters whispered into microphones, stunning development, children nearly deported mid-hearing. Chaos for administration. The words spread across the airwaves like sparks in dry grass. Trump slammed his fist on the table, barking about activist judges and fraudulent sob stories, but the sound was swallowed by the gravity of the headline replaying across every screen. For the first time, his fury looked small, his bluster like static against the thunder of truth. Jasmine's eyes never left him, her glare unyielding, daring him to look back at the chyron and deny what the whole world could see. Her words landed again, colder this time, like the final strike of a gavel. You talk about policy, I'm talking about children dragged onto planes like cargo. You talk about power, I'm talking about the moment we nearly lost our soul. The chamber was suffocating now, every breath heavy, every second stretched thin by anticipation. Outside, the chants fused into a single roar. No deportation, no invasion. The Capitol shook with the sound of a city fighting for its children. Inside, all eyes fell back on Jasmine, whose voice lured into a near whisper that carried sharper than any scream. When a government treats children as disposable pieces in a game of politics, who will stand between them and the abyss? The question wasn't just for Trump, nor for the lawmakers sitting frozen in their seats. It was for every American watching, every parent, every grandparent, every citizen whose heart was now pounding with the weight of 70 for young lives almost lost. And as silence settled again, heavy and trembling, the nation understood it had reached a point of no return. The headlines still burned red on every screen when Jasmine leaned into her microphone, her voice slow and deliberate, sharpened like a knife drawn across stone. Her eyes locked on Trump, refusing to blink, refusing to release him from the weight of her gaze. Do you call this protection or persecution? The words slammed into the chamber like a gavel, slicing through the murmurs, forcing every ear to turn toward the man at the center of the storm. The question was not abstract, not policy, it was blood, tears, and 74 children almost swallowed by an abyss. The camera cut instantly to Trump. For once, there was no smirk, no booming counterpunch, no practiced insult to fill the air. His lips parted, then closed, his chest rose, then stalled. His eyes darted to the screens, to the memo, to Maria's face still frozen in pixelated innocence clutching her bear. The microphones picked up only the faint hum of air conditioning and the relentless tick of a clock mounted above the chamber. 1 second, 2 seconds, the silence began to throb like a drumbeat. Journalists in the gallery counted under their breath, tense trembling against notepads. Producers whisper urgently into earpieces, "Stay on his face. Do not cut away." The live feed zoomed in so close that every bead of sweat, every twitch of muscle, every tremor of his jaw filled the screens of millions of households. By the 10th second, the air was suffocating. By the 20th, it was unbearable. By the 30th, it had become historic. And then 32 eternal seconds in, Trump was still silent, frozen under the crushing weight of the truth he could not deny and dared not confirm. Outside, the protesters sensed it, their chants morphing into a single deafening roar that seemed to shake the very bones of the Capitol. He can't answer, reporters repeated the count on live television, their voices trembling with disbelief. 32 seconds of silence from the President of the United States. The chamber was not merely a hearing room anymore, it was a courtroom, and the silence was the verdict. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, never breaking eye contact, her voice soft now but cutting all the same. The truth doesn't need to shout. It only needs time, and you just gave it 32 seconds. The words landed like a hammer, the kind that cracks stone. The tension in the chamber was electric, lawmakers shifting as if realizing they had just witnessed the unmasking of power. Trump's silence was louder than any outburst he could muster, and Jasmine knew it. And as the feed replayed across networks, Maria's plea echoed once more in the minds of millions, colliding with the image of a president unable to speak. The collision was undeniable, unforgettable, inescapable. And the question thundered through every protest, every newsroom, every living room in America. When children expose the truth, can power still hide, or will silence become its final confession? Trump's face, still flushed from the weight of 32 seconds of silence, hardened into stone as he leaned into the microphone. His voice detonated through the chamber, guttural and defiant, every word meant to reclaim ground he had just lost. "If Chicago won't cooperate," he thundered, fists pounding the desk, "then I'll send a guard." The echo ricocheted off marble walls and shattered the hush that had held the room hostage. Gasps erupted like gunfire. Some lawmakers clutched their desks, others turned to one another with wide eyes. The gallery shook as reporters shouted into their microphones, their words already streaking across the airwaves. Within seconds, phones buzzed across the chamber, news alerts flashing in real time. Trump threatens National Guard deployment to Chicago. Hashtags ignited instantly across social media. Hashtag send the guard. Hashtag no invasion. Hashtag Crockett vs. Trump. Protesters outside howled louder, the chants now fused with fear and fury, their voices colliding with the president's threat as if the streets themselves were answering him back. The nation wasn't watching anymore. It was trembling. Jasmine leaned forward slowly, her face illuminated by the storm of cameras. Her voice cut through the chaos like steel slicing glass, calm yet lethal. "That's martial law in disguise." The chamber fell silent again, but this time it was not the silence of awe, it was the silence of dread. The phrase hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Lawmakers glanced nervously toward the press gallery, knowing those words would headline every broadcast by nightfall. Trump stiffened, his glare sharpening, but his silence betrayed the sting. Jasmine's voice grew colder, more deliberate, pressing into the wound. "You do not protect a city by threatening to occupy it. You do not save children by sending soldiers with rifles into their neighborhoods. That is not leadership, that is domination dressed in the language of safety." Her words were punctuated by the muffled roar outside, as the crowd took up a new chant. No martial law. No invasion. The sound rattled the chamber, vibrating against the stone columns like a second heartbeat. Trump's hands gripped the desk tighter, knuckles blanching, his breathing audible through the microphones. His allies shifted uneasily, some whispering into each other's ears, others glaring at Jasmine with eyes that betrayed their fear of how badly the optics were unraveling. Reporters scribbled furiously, whispering into their cameras, "This is unprecedented. President openly threatening military deployment against an American city." The weight of those words pressed on everyone present, history carving itself in real time. Jasmine did not look away. She leaned even closer, her stare drilling into him, her voice dropping to a near whisper, making the nation lean closer to hear. "Say it plainly. Mr. President, are you prepared to turn American streets into battlefields against your own people?" The question slashed through the air like lightning, searing into every television screen, every protest line, every living room where Americans watch, their hearts pounding with dread and disbelief. And as Trump's silence deepened once again, as chants outside rose into a deafening roar, the chamber became more than a stage, it became a warning. And the question burned itself into the conscience of the nation, leaving no escape. If a president threatens his people with soldiers, who will protect the republic from its protector? The roar of protest still rattled the Capitol windows, and a new voice cut in through the live feed, crisp, sharp, unflinching. The massive screens above the chamber flickered, and suddenly Illinois Governor J.B. Pritzker appeared, framed against the Chicago skyline, the city lights burning like defiance behind him. His tone was steady but laced with fire. "You sent troops here," he declared, staring directly into the camera. "I call it invasion." The word detonated inside the hearing room, louder than any gavel, heavier than any chart. Lawmakers snapped their heads toward the screen, their faces tightening with the realization that a line had just been drawn in the sand. The broadcast instantly split the screen. On one side Trump, red-faced, jaw clenched, sweat gleaming under the relentless glare. On the other, Pritzker, unblinking, his words echoing through the chamber and out into millions of homes. The contrast was cinematic, the tension unbearable to figures locked in a duel not across a table, but across the very architecture of American democracy. The silence in the chamber was replaced by frantic murmurs, pens scratching, cameras swiveling to capture both men in one devastating frame. Social media exploded in real time. Hashtags ignited. Hashtag invasion or law. Hashtag Pritzker vs. Trump. Hashtag Chicago under siege. News anchors cut into live broadcasts with trembling voices. Extraordinary moment, Illinois governor directly confronting the president on live television. Outside, the protesters erupted again, chanting Pritzker's words as if they were their own battle cry. "No invasion, no invasion." The sound fused with the heartbeat of the city, a defiant rhythm pounding against the threat of militarization. Trump leaned forward, gripping the microphone so hard the metal squealed. His voice shook with fury. "You don't get to tell me how to run this country. Chicago is bleeding, and I'll do whatever it takes." He jabbed a finger toward the screen, his image snarling into the split broadcast. But Pritzker didn't flinch. His reply was calm, calculated, almost surgical. "What you call leadership, the rest of us call authoritarianism. If you dare turn soldiers on our streets, history won't call you strong, it will call you a tyrant." The words hung like a blade suspended in the air, gleaming with truth that could not be dodged. The chamber shook with no shouts, whispers, gasps, the clamor of history colliding with the present. Reporters scrambled to relay every word, their voices trembling as they narrated the spectacle for a nation splitting into before their eyes. Across America, families argued at dinner tables, bars went silent as screens blared, phones buzzed with headlines, Governor versus President in live clash over Chicago. The divide was no longer abstract, it was visible, visceral, undeniable. Fear spread in some hearts, outrage in others, but everyone understood one thing. The confrontation was no longer political theater, it was a constitutional crisis unfolding in real time. Jasmine sat motionless at her desk, eyes darting between the two men, her silence deliberate, her composure unshaken. She knew this was bigger than a battle of egos. This was the opening act of a fight for the soul of the Republic, and she was ready to deliver the blow that would decide which side of history would be written. And as the camera froze on the split screen, Trump's fury battling Pritzker's defiance, the question seared into every mind watching. When a president threatens his people and a governor dares to resist, which voice will America choose to follow? The chamber was still vibrating from Pritzker's defiance when Jasmine Crockett rose from her seat. She did not raise her voice at first. Instead, she let the weight of the moment pull every eye toward her. Slowly, deliberately, she opened the folder before her, sliding out a highlighted statute, her fingers steady as if she were drawing a weapon forged in law. She raised the paper high enough for the cameras to capture, her words measured but sharp enough to pierce steel. Perhaps the president has forgotten there are limits even to his power. The Constitution is not a tool. The Posse Comitatus Act forbids using the military as his personal police force. Soldiers are not his pawns, and America is not his battlefield. The room exploded in whispers, gasps, the frantic scribble of reporters, pens scratching like sparks across the gallery. Trump stiffened, his face hardening, but Jasmine pressed forward, her voice now swelling with fire. She turned her eyes directly to him, unflinching, daring him to look away. You posture like a commander, but you are nothing more than a wannabe general with no army of conscience. The line detonated through the chamber. Lawmakers jolting in their seats, cameras flashing to capture Trump's grimace as the insult sank deep. Outside, the chants grew deafening, the roar of thousands surging in unison, their voices now echoing her words back to the dome. Trump tried to interject, his mouth opening, but the swell of noise drowned him out. Reporters, in the gallery, or nearly shouting into their live feeds, narrating history as it cracked open in front of them. Crockett cites Posse Comitatus, Crockett calls President wannabe general. Chamber chaos, hashtags erupted across the country, the words already trending, memes forming, the narrative slipping further from his grip. The president's power had always been volume and spectacle, but Jasmine had just stolen both with one sentence wrapped in law and score. The chamber roared again, not in applause, but in raw energy, anger from Trump's allies, exhilaration from his opponents, disbelief from the undecided. Emotions crested like a wave about to crash, the air thick with the electricity of confrontation. Jasmine stood tall, her shoulders squared, her voice now ringing with a force that shook the rafters. Mr. President, you cannot wrap tyranny in the flag and call it patriotism. You cannot unleash soldiers on our children and call it law. Democracy is not your war room. Chicago is not your battlefield. The silence that followed wasn't weakness, it was stunned awe. Trump's hands tightened on the desk, veins throbbing, but he stayed silent, the fury visible in his clenched jaw, his shifting eyes. Across America, people leaned closer to their screens, sensing the air between them had turned toxic, unstable, primed for explosion. And Jasmine, her voice low and deadly, asked the question that hung over every beating heart, a challenge too sharp to ignore. Can democracy withstand a commander who treats his own cities as battlegrounds, or is this how a republic begins to fall? The chamber was still humming with the aftershocks of Jasmine's counterpunch when she leaned forward, her tone lowering into a scalpel's edge. She tapped the leaked memo still glowing on the giant screen, her fingers striking the damning line as if underlining history itself. If this is about immigration, Mr. President, why does your memo say political leverage? The words cut through the air like shrapnel. Every head in the chamber turned, every pen froze mid-scratch, every lens zoomed in tight on Trump's face. The camera caught it all in merciless clarity, his throat tightening, his lips parting, his voice stuttering on the syllables that once came so easily. That's fake, he muttered, but the defiance was gone, stripped bare by the evidence looming above him. His eyes darted between the memo and the audience, then down to his hands as if searching for a script that wasn't there. The silence that followed wasn't respectful, it was predatory, the kind that waits for the wounded animal to stumble. Journalists whispered hot into their mix. He's rattled. He can't answer directly. Producers in newsrooms shouted, "Stay tight on his face, don't cut." The broadcast lingered, magnifying every bead of sweat, every twitch in his jaw, every falter in his breath. Jasmine didn't move, didn't blink, didn't give him a second of escape. She let the silence swell like a noose tightening around his words. Trump cleared his throat, tried again, but the stammer betrayed him. The strongest man in the room, the loudest voice in American politics, cornered not by volume, but by one line of ink on paper. And Jasmine, her voice calm but sharp as glass, delivered the strike that echoed far beyond the chamber. Because this was never about safety, it was always about power. The chamber held its breath, the protesters outside roared louder, their voices colliding with the silence inside. And the question seared itself into the conscience of the nation. If a president cannot answer when truth stares him in the face, how much longer can power hide behind the mask of authority? The chamber quivered as if the marble itself could feel the pulse of the city outside. The muffled rumble that had been background noise all day suddenly surged into a thunderclap. Protest chants, once faint, now crashed through the walls in unison, their rhythm captured by hot microphones and carried live into millions of homes. Chicago will not kneel. The words shook the chamber like artillery, each syllable pounding against the polished wood and echoing into the ears of lawmakers, reporters, and the president himself. For the first time, the hearing felt less like a political proceeding and more like a battlefield. The roar outside fused with the tension inside, until the chamber itself trembled under the weight of defiance. Reporters in the gallery turned their microphones toward the windows, amplifying the sound of a city rising against the threat. Producers barked into headsets, "Keep it live, don't mute the crowd." On split screens across America, viewers saw Trump's stiff face on one side and streets filled with surging voices on the other, the collision of power and resistance broadcast in real time. Trump tried to speak, but the chants swallowed him whole, every attempt drowned out by the defiant cry. He scowled, raising his voice, but the crowd only grew louder, their rhythm tightening, their words punching through stone. "Chicago will not kneel. Chicago will not kneel." Jasmine sat posed, letting the noise pour into the chamber, her silence weaponized by the chorus of her city. She leaned slightly toward her microphone, eyes still locked on Trump, and whispered just loud enough for cameras to capture. "Do you hear them? That's America, not your echo chamber." The line, though quiet, cut louder than the chants. A blade slipped between the chaos. The building itself seemed to vibrate, with the clash of voices and silence, the collision of truth and power. Viewers at home felt it in their bones, not just watching but living inside the moment as though they too sat at the trembling desk. Every second stretched taut, every chant sharpening into a verdict shouted by thousands. And as Trump's lips pressed tight, his fury swallowed by the roar, the question no longer belonged to politicians or pundits, it belonged to the people pounding at the walls. When the streets themselves rise to speak, can even the highest office drown out their truth? The roar of the crowd still rattled the chamber when Jasmine delivered her final blow, her words slicing through the chaos like steel. Trump opened his mouth, ready to unleash another torrent of bluster, but nothing came. His lips trembled, his jaw clenched, and then silence. The cameras zoomed in mercilessly, filling every television screen in America with the image of a president suddenly mute, stripped of his weapon of words. Networks flashed a stopwatch graphic in the corner of the broadcast. 1 second. 2 seconds. 3. The silence expanded like a cracking glass, spreading, deepening, impossible to look away from. By the 10th second, whispers hissed through the chamber. By the 20th, reporters were counting under their breath, their voices trembling into live microphones. By the 30th, the crowd outside picked it up, chanting the number aloud, their voices sensing with the broadcast, turning silence into spectacle. And then it dragged further still. 35, 40, 45, each heartbeat televised, each second a blade carving into the image of authority he had built. 47 eternal seconds, when he finally shifted, clearing his throat, the damage was already permanent. Authority had fractured live on air, not with an explosion, but with a void. It wasn't what Trump said that stunned the nation, it was what he could not say. Millions of viewers sat frozen in living rooms, bars, and airports, watching power collapse under the weight of its own silence. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, her expression steady, eyes never leaving him, to silence itself now her weapon. And as the stopwatch froze on the screen, bold letters flashing 47 seconds, the question ripped across the conscience of the nation like thunder rolling through a battlefield. When a leader cannot answer, who truly leads? The moment the stopwatch froze at 47 seconds, the hearing chamber dissolved into chaos and the nation erupted into analysis. News anchors, commentators, and strategists flooded the airwaves, their voices colliding in a frenzy to define what America had just witnessed. Lulu Garcia-Navarro's words sliced through the din on NPR, replayed instantly on television chirons. Morality is no longer theory, it's testimony. Her tone was not speculative, it was declarative, as though history itself had already delivered its verdict. The clip went viral in seconds, spliced into protest footage, amplified by millions of retweets and furious captions. On MSNBC, Democratic strategist Adrienne O'Rourke's voice carried the gravity of political obituary. "This was Trump's Waterloo," she declared, her face lit with the unmistakable weight of finality. The phrase ignited headlines. Waterloo on Live TV. Protesters outside the Capitol took up the word like a chant, their cries of Waterloo. Waterloo, pounding in rhythm with the drums and bullhorns that echoed across Chicago's streets. What began as defiance now swelled into euphoria, a carnival of resistance, fireworks bursting in some neighborhoods as if the city itself were announcing its refusal to kneel. Inside the chamber, reporters spoke over one another, their voices a storm of astonishment, unprecedented collapse. The silence heard around the world. Crockett shatters the narrative. Every network replayed the footage on loop, the stopwatch graphic burning itself into the collective memory of a nation. Trump, still framed, jaw tight, eyes vacant, lips frozen, was already destined for textbooks, his silence weaponized into a symbol of defeat. The frenzy spiraled outward, engulfing not just Washington but the very mood of the country. Some Americans felt vindicated, others betrayed, but all understood they had crossed into new territory, or every second of hesitation could rewrite history. And as Jasmine Crockett's unflinching stare replayed alongside the chants of a city rising, one question thundered louder than any commentary, demanding to be answered. If silence can bring down the strongest man in America, what else might it topple next? Jasmine Crockett rose slowly, the weight of the chamber pressing down, the roar of protesters vibrating through the walls, the image of a president's silence still burning on every screen. She placed both hands firmly on the desk, her voice cutting across the noise with the clarity of a bell tolling for history. No president above the law. No community below its shield. The words rang out, sharp and unshakable, and for a moment it seemed the very marble columns leaned closer to listen. The response was immediate, volcanic. Applause erupted like thunder inside the chamber, lawmakers pounding their desks, some standing to their feet, their faces lit with the electricity of defiance turned into unity. Reporters shouted into their microphones, struggling to be heard over the roar, their voices trembling as they repeated the line destined to be etched into headlines worldwide. Outside, the chants shifted instantly, the crowd seizing on Jasmine's words, their voices rising in unison until the air itself cracked. Stand with Chicago. Stand with Chicago. Hashtags exploded across the globe, glowing like a wildfire on every device. Hashtag Stand with Chicago surging to the top within minutes. The emotion was overwhelming, a tidal wave cresting after hours of confrontation. Protesters wept and embraced in the streets, strangers united by a moment larger than themselves. In living rooms across America, families leaned closer to their televisions, goosebumps rippling as Jasmine's words replayed again and again, the soundtrack of a nation rediscovering its pulse. And as she stood there, unflinching, framed against the chaos and the cheers, Jasmine was no longer just a lawmaker, she was the embodiment of a question that could no longer be ignored. If one voice can pierce through silence and fear, what power might millions carry when they rise together? The hearing dissolved into history as the cameras cut to the streets. Jasmine Crockett walked out of the Capitol into a sea of raised fists and tear-streaked faces. Protesters surged toward her, not in chaos, but in reverence, hands reaching out, voices chanting her name until it blended with the roar of Stand with Chicago. She shook hands firmly, embraced strangers like family, her face etched with exhaustion but burning with resolve. Every grip, every nod, every tear wiped away was more than ceremony, it was a promise that her fight was theirs, and theirs was hers. The montage unfolded like a nation's heartbeat. In one frame, Jasmine leaning down to comfort an elderly woman clutching a sign that read "No child is illegal." In another, her hand resting gently on the shoulder of a veteran who whispered through tears, "You reminded me why I wore the uniform." And then, a shift to Maria, the little girl with the teddy bear now smiling softly inside a shelter, her eyes no longer hollow with fear but lit with the fragile glow of safety. The camera lingered on her small fingers tracing the stitches of her bear, a child allowed to breathe again because someone refused to let her be silenced. As the images bled together, the narration cut through with the weight of scripture, timeless and unyielding. A warrior is measured not by the enemies she defeats, but by the lads she defends. The words fell heavy, reverberating across the images of Jasmine walking shoulder to shoulder with her people, a single figure carrying the weight of a city, a voice that had forced power itself into silence. The music swelled, the chants outside surged like a second heartbeat, and the closing shot froze on Jasmine's face as she raised her fist against the darkened sky. And then, the final question seared into the screen, daring every viewer not just to watch but to act. If silence can reveal the truth, what will your voice fight for today? True courage is not measured by how loud we speak, but by whether we choose to speak when silence feels safer. Jasmine's stand reminds us that leadership is not about power, but about protecting the vulnerable, even when the cost is high. In our own lives, we may not stand in Congress, but we all face moments where fear tempts us to stay quiet. Those moments define who we are. The measure of our character lies in whether we defend truth, even when it shakes the room. So ask yourself, when injustice stands before you, will you stay silent or will you rise? Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.